Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see you today, and I welcome you to the hold on one second, the 108th, I think it's our 108th, right, David? Consecutive week of programming. Welcome from Jews United for Democracy and Justice and from Community Advocates, Inc. And for our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine, Zev Yaroslavsky, Rabbi Ken Chazen, Caroline Kelly, David Lair, and myself. We are very pleased tonight to welcome the ever insightful New York Times journalist, David Leonhardt, in conversation with LA's very own and beloved Larry Mantle. We are in the midst of primary season. And so in that vein, and with an eye on the quickly approaching midterms next week, we welcome back one of America's leading polling experts and astute analysts, Ron Brownstein. He is the senior political analyst at CNN and a managing editor of The Atlantic. He'll be joined by another of the country's exceptional political analysts, Bob Shrum. After a long and impressive career as a political consultant, Bob is now the director of the Center for Political Future and the Carmen and Lewis Warshaw Chair in Practical Politics at USC. It should be a great evening, and we'll look forward to seeing you all there. The following week, on June 22nd, we return to the critical topic of voter suppression as we welcome two of the country's experts on that topic. Greg Bluestein is a political reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He is a frequent MSNBC and NBC contributor. He wrote the recently published book, Flipped: How Georgia Turned Purple and Broke the Monopoly on Republican Power. And frequently he writes about voter suppression. Rick Hasen, author of Cheap Speech and UC Irvine law professor in the field of election law. He will soon to be a UCLA Law School election law expert and professor. He's one of the country's most published authors on the topic of voter suppression, so it should be a really great conversation. Now, my wonderful colleague, David, will tell you about a few more of our upcoming programs.
Thank you, the wonderful Janice Kaminer-Resnick. I'm looking forward to tonight's discussion with a truly exceptional journalist. He sheds light and offers data on an impressively wide array of topics. It should be a truly illuminating hour. As you may have noticed on the upcoming event screen a few moments ago, the speakers just seem to be getting more and more interesting as we progress. After the two programs that Janice mentioned, we will host the New York Times' Peter Baker and the New Yorker's Susan Glasser, both of whom covered Putin and Russia for 4 years while living in Moscow. And they also write about the White House and the goings-on in Washington. They are the reporters you want to hear from as the January 6th committee hearings take place and as the Russo-Ukraine war continues unabated. They have a soon-to-be-released book in a couple of months entitled The Divider: Trump in the White House. The following week, we will hear from the New York Times' David Brooks, one of its most distinguished writers who's been on the Times op-ed page since 2003. He's also a commentator on the PBS NewsHour, NPR's All Things Considered, and NBC's Meet the Press. In an exciting development as of today, we secured David Gergen for later this summer. Gergen has been an advisor to Presidents Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and Clinton, a likely unmatched foursome of diverse employers. He preceded Brooks as the regular conservative commentator on the PBS NewsHour, and he's the author of the just-released book, Hearts Touched with Fire: How Great Leaders Are Made. To moderate tonight's discussion and introduce this evening's guest, a longtime friend, the pillar of public radio station KPCC in Southern California. He's hosted Air Talk, a daily news program, for over 35 years, Larry Mantle. Like our guest, Larry can discuss just about any topic with ease and wisdom. Larry?
Thank you so much, David, Janice, Zeb, and Mel. It's always a pleasure to be with you for America to Crossroads. And hearing the lineup that you've got coming up, David, it's just phenomenal. The kinds of conversations we're going to be hearing as a part of these programs every Wednesday throughout the summer. I'll look forward to seeing them and hopefully participating in some. It's hard to believe that it's been more than 2 years that we've been doing these programs, and I've been honored to be a part of these conversations on such critical issues for our nation. For those of you who live in the greater Los Angeles area who listen to KPCC, You likely know that I've been hosting a daily update on COVID-19 as part of my Air Talk program. I speak with infectious disease specialists, epidemiologists, emergency room physicians, getting the latest on COVID-19. And it became popular. We spun it off as a daily podcast called COVID in LA at the height of the pandemic. But of course, as you know, COVID has received all kinds of polarized response to the public health measures that have come from that. And our guest this evening, no stranger to that as well. That's just one of many topics that we're going to get into, as he so beautifully takes data, interprets it for readers of the New York Times. We're going to be talking as well about the expected overturning of Roe v. Wade from the U.S. Supreme Court, gun laws, particularly with today's House passage of a package of gun control measures, racial preferences, and much more. Again, at the heart of what David Leonhardt writes about, data and its uses in analyzing and explaining current events. For just over 2 years, David has written the morning newsletter for the New York Times. He also contributes to the Times Sunday Review, and he's held multiple positions at the paper, including Washington bureau chief. He was economics columnist and managing editor of The Upshot. Prior to joining the Times, he wrote for Business Week and the Washington Post. He's the recipient of a Pulitzer Prize for commentary for what the Pulitzer Committee called his graceful penetration of America's complicated economic questions, from the federal budget deficit to healthcare reform. He'd previously been a Pulitzer finalist before winning the award. He's also recipient of the highly prestigious Gerald Loeb Award for magazine writing. David, welcome back to America at a Crossroads. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Oh, it's great to be here. This is such a wonderful speaker series, and I'm looking forward to our conversation, and it's an honor to be part of this series.
And I want to remind all of you who are viewing across the United States and even internationally, when you put a question in the Q&A, if you would please put your location. It would be wonderful to know from where the question's coming, your first name as well. Just nice to give a sense of place with all those that are asking questions this evening. Let's begin, David, with dueling interpretations or characterizations of the U.S. economy. On the one hand, we have the highest inflation rate we've had in decades, most notably with gasoline, a widening wealth gap, a clogged supply chain, and growing deficit. On the other hand, our jobs, which are plentiful, home equity is way up, retirement accounts have ballooned, and wages for lower income workers have finally risen. So what do we make of all this and the sort of conflicting data that comes on our economy?
So let's start. I think that's exactly the right way to think about it, that the economy isn't good and it isn't bad, it's both. But we can be a little clearer than that. And so we'll try to do that here. And I'll take your question as exactly the frame that I'll use. Let's start with the good news, which was the last part of your question. When the recession that came out of that COVID caused was in some ways the steepest descent into recession that our country's ever gone through. I mean, we lost millions and millions of jobs in the span of just a couple months. That didn't even happen in October and November 1929. The stock market didn't crash, and you didn't have, millions upon millions of people immediately thrown out of work. But we did have that with COVID. At least, even if they didn't lose their job permanently, they weren't working. And I think the great fear was that we were going to repeat what happened in the wake of the 2007 to 2009 financial crisis, which is it was going to take years to recover. That people were going to years to get the unemployment rate back down. And because of really aggressive policy response, which was bipartisan, which isn't something that we see very often. At least the beginning of it was bipartisan. When President Trump was in office, Democrats voted for the stimulus bill. Once President Biden came into office, Republicans did not vote for the stimulus bill. We can get into some of the details there if you want. But as a whole, it was bipartisan. And the idea of kind of getting the U.S. economy cranking again, which by no means was a given, particularly when you think about the fact that Delta came and knocked us off, and then Omicron came. We've done that. People are working. I mean, if you wanna find a job, you can go find a job. There are lots of good paying jobs. The Times just ran a story about the concern that there is sufficiently high number of decent paying jobs that some people are worried that people are dropping out of college in order to take a good retail job. And in the long term, you'd probably rather have a 20-year-old getting a degree than working an hourly job today. So that's the good news. But I don't think Americans are wrong to say that they're unhappy with the economy. I mean, so you mentioned inflation. That's the really obvious and the most important thing that's going on. And some of that is we probably did overreact a little bit too much to COVID. It was impossible to know exactly how much, and we pumped so much money into the system that it's caused some inflation. I'd say that's the second factor. The first factor is that the whole world is dealing with inflation because of COVID supply chain problems. It's not like we're the only country dealing with inflation, or even that our inflation is vastly higher than other countries. But it's not just inflation. I mean, think about this. If you want to buy a minivan right now, and any people in the audience who have been trying to buy a minivan lately, you know it's miserable. I haven't been, but I've heard about people who are. If you're trying to buy a house in a place like Denver or Austin, Texas, it's not simply that they're expensive, they're really hard to find any. And then you think about other things. Your kid goes to the bus stop in the morning, and then you get a call on your cell phone. You know what? The bus driver didn't show up because we have a shortage of bus drivers. You have to stop working and come get your kid. Or the pool that you normally go to this summer isn't going to open because they can't get lifeguards. And you think about all these things, those are all parts of the economy. And so we have had this once in a century pandemic, and it really has caused a whole bunch of disruptions to our economy that affect people's lives in real ways. So in the traditional problems that we've had for much of the last 20 years, the economy is doing just fine. But we also have a bunch of new problems that are real and that aren't about to go away, and that really do make life difficult and unpleasant for a lot of people out there.
And how much did the stimulus contribute to this? Because you alluded to that, but in putting so much money into Americans' pockets, driving up demand for products, and then coupling that with supply chain problems because of COVID, how much did, in a sense, we bring this on ourselves through policy?
I think we aggravated it, but I don't think policy caused it. And so again, if you go looking around the world, inflation is bad in basically every country in the world that looks anything like the US economically. The war in Ukraine is driving up gas prices. COVID disruptions in China are causing supply chain problems. COVID disruptions all over the place are causing supply chain problems. And so if you ask me, without the massive amount of stimulus, would we have still most of this problem? We would. I do think that the stimulus exacerbated the problem. I do think, and I say this as someone who, like many people, did not predict the inflation. So I'm not saying this is a told you so. I was wrong about how bad inflation would be, like a lot of other people. When I try to write a year-end column about things I got wrong the prior year, and inflation was one of the three things I cited for 2021. So, but the Biden administration and Congress were among those people who were surprised by it. And I think in retrospect, or maybe not even in retrospect, but to me, one of the things that stands out as a mistake is, I think it was a mistake to send checks to nearly everybody. There are a lot of white collar workers out there who never had to go on layoff for their job. They were able to continue doing their job from their living room or from their attic, or where many people are listening to the show tonight. They never lost a paycheck. These are relatively privileged people, to be clear. They never lost a paycheck. If anything, some of their expenses went down because they weren't commuting and they weren't traveling and they weren't going out to meals with their families on Friday night. So they actually financially were doing better. And then we put a whole lot of money in these people's bank accounts. And
so had we targeted the stimulus more narrowly, you think that might have helped a bit?
Yeah, it would have been smaller, right? And so a lot of families who really just didn't need the stimulus at all wouldn't have gotten it. Now, I raised these questions with policymakers who were doing it at the time. I said, why are you sending it to everyone? Most people are doing just fine. They said it's really hard to target. I would say I both disagree with that, and they're right that it's a serious challenge. Targeting is not easy. But I do think that in retrospect, if I put it this way, the Biden administration, forget about what they're saying publicly. If you said to them, you get a do-over, you get to do that stimulus program again. Does anyone actually think it would be as big as it was if they got to do it again? No, it wouldn't.
All right. Let's talk about gas, because that's, of course, the most obvious, biggest problem when it comes to inflation, particularly in industries that are reliant on moving goods and people who make their living by driving, or in Southern California, where we're based, who do very long commutes. The cost of this is deeply felt, perhaps not in cities as much where public transit is the rule, but in parts of the country like where we are in greater Los Angeles, it's a really big deal. And I've been hearing from listeners who this has financially upended their lives because of the cost of and they can't just go out and buy an electric car. It's not, that sort of option is not available because of the supply chain problems. We don't see anything in the foreseeable future that's going to be bringing gas prices down. What is the political effect of that on particularly Democrats in the midterms and ultimately on President Biden?
Yeah. So there was a great article in the New Republic a few decades ago, "All economic news is bad news." And it was tweaking those of us in the media for basically always looking at the kind of dark side of economic news, right? And so I don't want to commit that sin here, or I'm going to try not to. So I just described the problem that we pumped too much money in the economy. We gave Americans too much money. Now we're going to talk about a new problem, which is rising gas prices. They're both real problems. I just want to acknowledge that they do counteract each other a little bit, right? We send Americans a lot of cash, and I get that people are grouchy about higher gas prices, but money's fungible, and that extra cash that we sent them during the pandemic has cushioned lots of people in ways that make the gas prices easier for many people to manage. Now, there are certainly people out there. If you live in inland California, or if you live in upstate New York, or you live in Montana, and you're driving, hundreds and hundreds of miles every week, I'm not saying that that it's even. It may not be. You may be down. But Americans headed in a few months ago. Americans' financial status was just fantastic in historical terms. So people do enter this with a cushion. Now, psychologically, gas prices don't just hurt your pocketbook, they also have a big impact on you. And so, look, it's bad for any party in power. It really is. It is not good for the Democrats. Midterms usually are not good for the party in power in this country. Certainly when we have people as angry about inflation as we do now. It's not clear to me what the Democrats can do about inflation. If they had to do it again, they could have designed a smaller stimulus program, which might have taken, I don't know, few tenths of a percent, maybe a full percentage point or two off inflation, but inflation would still be quite bad. And look, Vladimir Putin has launched an imperial war of aggression against a European democracy. And if you said to me, what is the worst outcome for the world? He gets away with that, or gas prices go up. I think it's that gas prices go up, but that doesn't in any way dispute everything that you said, which is
and of course, gas prices were going up before the invasion of Ukraine as well. But let's talk about the Fed's role in this. And so the Fed is trying to balance how much it tries to get a handle on inflation and mitigate that at the same time, not trying to exacerbate recessionary forces as well. So your thoughts on where the Fed is likely to go, and what's the debate probably like within the Fed over how to deal with the competing forces?
I mean, there's no free lunch. The only way for the Fed to try to bring inflation down is to risk a recession. That's it, right? It's the Fed's tool is raising interest rates. Raising interest rates helps bring inflation down. It also raises the risk of recession because people are less likely to spend in all kinds of ways. So what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to get the balance just right. It's very hard. It's impossible to know exactly what the balance looks like in the moment. I think we are fortunate that for all of our government dysfunction, the Fed remains a highly functional institution. And I say that as someone who's written quite critically about a number of their decisions over the last 15 years. It doesn't make them perfect, but there really are dedicated people there who are trying to get the right answer and trying to get to it and put it in place. And it's basically a question of raising interest rates just enough at just the right time to try to bring down inflation without causing a recession. It's extremely hard to do. The thing I would remind everyone is when you hear economic forecasters, most of them say a recession is unlikely. You should just ignore that prediction, because it is simultaneously true that a recession is unlikely. And that is all that the economic consensus ever says, that a recession is unlikely. And so just throw that out.
Okay. Here in Southern California, and I presume this is an issue in other parts of the country, we rely heavily on an undocumented workforce. And with immigration being at lower levels over the past couple of years, that seems to have exacerbated the problems that we're having, particularly in the service sector of the economy. So what is potentially in the offing to deal with that issue, given the impasse over immigration policy between the parties?
Yeah, I think, look, our broken immigration system causes all kinds of problems on sort of both ends of things. We have both too much, or we have some of the problems of too much and some of the problems of too little immigration. It's sort of a value judgment of whether you think we should have more or less overall. And I understand both cases. So, as you've noted, the kind of decline in immigration, both because the Trump administration's relatively restrictive immigration policies and because of COVID, have created real problems. They've exacerbated our worker shortages. It's certainly true that in the short term, one of the ways to deal with our worker shortage, and by extension, bring down inflation, would be to admit more people. I mean, admitting more immigrants and expanding the workforce really is an anti-inflationary policy. And it's interesting, when Larry Summers, who's one of the people who's been most warning about inflation, went on Ezra Klein's New York Times podcast, and Ezra said, what can the government do in the short term? My memory of Larry's answer is he basically said, not that much, but we could probably admit some more people. So there are all kinds of cases for immigration. We also, unlike China, our main rival for global power, we are a place where millions of people around the world want to come. And so there's also, there's a national security, there's an economic argument, there's a global influence argument for admitting more of the people who want to come here and asking them to become Americans, particularly if they're talented and they can contribute to our economy or hardworking. Having said all that,
I was going to ask if you think it's both in the educated immigrant workforce and those who would be working at minimum wage level service industry jobs as well.
I mean, certainly in our history, both categories of immigrants, highly educated immigrants, the Albert Einsteins, and then the less educated immigrants, many of our ancestors, have both contributed to this country. Having said all that, I want to take seriously the argument that people make about having a more restrictive immigration policy or having tighter border security. I think one of the things that has been unfortunate is that at elite levels of both parties, there has been this kind of consensus, a pro-immigration, a more immigration consensus. And people have almost marginalized the people who argue for immigration restriction as sort of, either being racist or being ignorant. And the fact is, huge numbers of Americans who vote for both parties across races favor tight border security, favor immigration enforcement. And there are real arguments for this. We have just come out of a 50-year period. We're still in a 50-year period with historically high immigration rates, both legal and illegal. If you look at the percentage of the population that was born in another country, it is historically very high. And that does have downsides. People often look back to the 1930s to the 1970s as a golden age for the American worker, when wages rose really rapidly for the poor, for the middle class. They rose really rapidly across racial groups. What else was the case during the 30s, from the 30s to the 70s? We didn't have a lot of immigration. Rank and file workers faced less competition for their services. And it was also a period of greater political consensus. I'm not saying we would magically go back to political consensus with less immigration, but historically, more immigration does tend to increase political tensions. And I do think an immigration policy that actually took serious the arguments for restriction, but also figured out how to admit people, would be better than what we've had, which is this broken system with with a lot of immigration without really debating it, and also a lot of illegal immigration.
Well, and I do think that elected officials are understanding that with many Latinos in this country, there is also a very strong anti-illegal immigration sentiment. We hear it on our program in Los Angeles, that this, there's been sort of the perception, Latinos in the US are, for open borders, are very pro undocumented growth in the population, and that is by no means monolithic. So there is a lot of nuance in that argument. I think it's very good you raise that point. This is not all a nativist sort of perspective. Nevertheless, we never seem to get to that debate when it comes to public policy.
Right, we don't. And we almost got there, right? I mean, it seemed like we were going to get there after Obama won re-election in 2012, and the Republicans looked inward and they sort of said, our problem is that we're not appealing to a diverse enough electorate. That was one theory. It was sort of the theory of a lot of top people in the Republican Party. But then basically what happened is it became clear that they really underestimated the amount of concern about immigration and opposition to immigration that there was among Republican rank and files, and not just Republican rank and files, right? Now, Donald Trump has said all kinds of racist things. So it is true that you can be in favor of immigration restrictions without being racist. Donald Trump did not manage to achieve that balance, right? He both was in favor of immigration restrictions and said a lot of racist things. But there are many, many Americans who were attracted to that position without necessarily harboring racist beliefs. And so I do think that at this point, given the way the politics have evolved, we're not going to get some elite deal where you've got elite Democrats and elite Republicans and the Chamber of Commerce and a lot of think tanks that come together and kind of push through the old immigration compromise. It's going to have to be something that also takes seriously the populist beliefs that are running through both the Republican and Democratic parties. And as you just noted, are running not just through white voters, but large numbers of voters of color as well. I mean, when it comes down to it, are you in favor of open borders? I know Republicans have turned that into a little bit of an exaggeration, but are you in favor of open borders? If you are not in favor of open borders, then you have to answer questions like, how do you keep the border secure? Whom do you deport based on if they're here illegally or break the law? And once you're having that debate, it's all a matter of where the dial goes. And I think it's important to let into that debate people who are in favor of less immigration than we've had over the last 50 years.
David, I want to turn our attention to race relations, because the polling that we see consistently shows Americans have real concerns about racial discord in the country, see racial division as higher than we've seen in decades. And yet, I've looked at other studies which, talk about, well, how do you feel about your friends and neighbors who are different, races or ethnicities? And just anecdotally, we know people tend to have very different views about the people in their world than what their concerns about the country writ large. And so I wonder, how do we make sense of this? That so often we have a different perspective of the world immediately around us versus the larger world. And what does that say about our ability to move forward with racial unification in this country?
I mean, it should offer some reason for optimism, shouldn't it? Right? Meaning that people get ginned up by all these national issues, but in their day-to-day lives, they're basically decent and they like their neighbor, even if their neighbor it looks different from them. So I don't want to be Pollyannish about it, but I would say on some basic level, it should give us some optimism. It's not just about race, of course. You ask people, is the American education system good or bad? And they tend to give it a big thumbs down. And then you say, how's your kid's teacher? And they say, my kid's teacher is great, right? There's even a version of it with the economy right now. People, inflation is probably going to chip into this a little bit, but people have been saying their personal finances are quite good, and they don't say the economy is good. So I do think that whether it's something about the American psyche or something about the polarized times we live in, lots of people say the world is going to hell in a handbasket, but then you ask them about their school or their friends or their own lives, and it looks a little more positive. Look, I worry a lot about the condition of race relations in this country, and I worry a lot about the enduring racial inequities that we have, and I worry about racism. I mean, we have had a kind of strain of white nationalism emerge over the last 5 to 7 years that I never, frankly, expected to see in this country. Donald Trump fomented a lot of it, but it's not solely Donald Trump. I mean, large parts of the Republican Party have gotten comfortable with a version of white nationalism that I think is really dangerous. I mean, Liz Cheney has said this. I think that is that is one of the problems. I think another problem is we've just made a much less progress on racial equality than many people would have expected. I mean, the white-black income gap hasn't really shrunk much in 40 years. That's really disturbing. If you start to measure it, taking into account people who aren't in the workforce, and by some measures it's gotten worse because of mass incarceration. And then I know this will bother some people on the left who will accuse me of both sidesism, but I do think there's a problem on the left. It's not necessarily of the equivalent size, but there is an obsession with race, particularly among highly educated progressives, that it's a little bit hard for me to see how it is productive. It particularly seems to be hurting Democrats' ability to win elections. And so some people refer to this as the Latinx problem. The fact that if you ask Hispanic or Latino people what word they would like to use to describe their group, virtually none of them say Latinx. Many of them say they don't like it. But if you go into really highly progressive, highly educated circles, it's sort of become this version of performative liberalism. And I think that there is this whole problem on the left of sometimes trying to turn every debate into a debate about race, which I actually think often undermines the cause of addressing our deep racial inequities and even racism in this country.
And how so? You think it pushes people away from having then real conversations about race because they feel it's either performative or exaggerated, or that lens is overused? What do you see as the reason for that?
Yeah, I think it can make it hard for people to have conversations. I think if Democrats get on the wrong side of public opinion on a bunch of these issues, it means they lose elections. I mean, you're in California, right? I mean, you sort of see it's not just about race, but you sort of see how a lot of Democrats a while ago decided that the only position that was consistent with racial justice was defund the police. Right? Well, actually, it turns out that most Americans, including most Black voters and most Latino voters, really are opposed to the idea of defunding the police. And Democrats who tried to have that approach are now sometimes losing elections. Democrats who reject that approach, it becomes a weight around them and it hurts them. And I just think that there has been, again, in elite progressive circles, there is often a desire to turn absolutely everything into a debate about race. And look, racism is such a deep and enduring problem in this country that it does indeed undergird nearly every problem we have. But that doesn't make it the dominant force in every problem we have. And it doesn't mean that using certain words that have become popular on campuses actually do much to solve those problems. And so I think one of the things that Democrats need to do a little bit more than they have is actually look at what do the African-American voters and Latino voters who are reliable Democratic voters, who are their base, what do they want on a lot of these issues? And it often doesn't look exactly like what Twitter wants or what a college campus wants.
Twitter's not the real world.
Yeah.
Let's, because this is a nice segue into the writing that you've done on affirmative action. And of course, you know, in California with Proposition 209 for public institutions, they're not able to take race and ethnicity into account for public colleges and universities and other public sector employment issues in the way that private institutions are. You've, I know, looked at data on this and looked at also socioeconomic affirmative action versus race and ethnicity-based affirmative action. And what are some of the things that you see there in those comparisons?
So I think we've ended up with a system that places enormous weight on race and very little weight on class. And first of all, let's acknowledge we're now just talking about elite institutions, right? Most students, you don't need to get into UCLA in order to go get a college degree. And getting a college degree is really, really important. Where you get it from is less important to your long-term life outcomes. So we're talking about elite institutions. I still think they matter for a whole bunch of reasons, but that's what we're talking about. And so outside of California and the states that have outlawed it, what you basically have had historically is a system that puts a lot of weight on race and very little, and not just race, it also puts weight on geography and puts very little weight on class. And that strikes me as problematic because when I look at the data, what I see is that if we were going to design an affirmative action program that was truly meritocratic, that said, we want to admit the most promising and qualified people, kids for college, applicants for a job. We want to do the people who have really done the best job with what they've been able to do. We want to give people credit when they've been having to run into the wind. If I've had the wind in my back and the person running in a lane next to me to do a physical impossibility has had the wind in their face, and I beat her by 0.2 of a second, her race was still more impressive than mine. And let's acknowledge that, right? And so if there's only one spot, let's give it to her, not me. And so for a long time, what we've been doing is we've been putting nearly all the weight on race and very little on class. I think actually a fair system would put more weight on class than race, but still put substantial weight on race, because we know from a very wide variety of evidence that racism, and particularly anti-Black racism, but not only anti-Black racism, is a major problem in American society. And so what I would say is that an affirmative action program that reflected reality and that was attempting to be fair would kind of give a bigger boost, although I don't even like that word because it's only making up for disadvantage on class, but still have a significant one on race. The politics of this have gotten so messed up that basically lots of people are in favor of race and don't pay attention to class, and lots of people are opposed to race and don't pay attention to class. But the Supreme Court might be about to outlaw affirmative action by race, in which case institutions might have to get more aggressive about class.
Well, and it's something we look at the University of California system, for example, they have had to find other ways, not being able to use race as a way of diversifying the student body, and have had some degree of success in doing that.
Yes, they have. Now, I haven't looked at the numbers for the most recent class. They also had real declines in their African-American population for some periods of time on some campuses. And so, again, I understand why people kind of like the idea of a race-neutral system. John Roberts' famous line, the way to stop discriminating based on race is to stop discriminating based on race. That's a paraphrase, but his line is a little more eloquent, but that's it. But the thing is, we live in a racist society, and so it's really hard to pretend otherwise and then get rid of any racial considerations in the process. To me, the mistake that defenders of affirmative action have made is that they haven't taken seriously just how unpopular this program is. It basically loses whenever it's on the ballot, even in California.
Even in California, yes.
Even in California. And Democrats sometimes say, yes, but this poll shows it's popular. Don't show me a poll. Basically, whenever it's on a referendum, it loses. So this isn't something that Americans are particularly in favor of, including in California in the most recent election, very large numbers of Asian Americans and Latino Americans. And so to me, looking for a program that I think is potentially both fairer than the current system that we have, and also has a broader base of political support, seems to be the way to go. The issue is the Supreme Court may say that despite the amount of racism in our society, and despite the fact that I think the kind of fairest affirmative action program would make race one of its factors, I think there's a very good chance that it's just going to be outlawed.
David, let's talk about guns today. The House of Representatives passed a package of gun control measures. It includes a ban on the purchase of semi-automatic rifles by those under the age of 21, like the weapons that have been used in the most recent terrible mass shootings that we've had, unlikely to be passed by the Senate. But we look at data on gun control methods and what they show, and I always find it difficult because there's so many moving parts to try and interpret, what gun control does and how it affects mass shootings. So, what does the data show you?
this doesn't necessarily point to a solution. I know that for many people it does, but I want to start by preface this by saying this doesn't necessarily point to a solution. But I think it's really important to acknowledge the reality that we can go in the weeds and we can say which policy might prevent which kind of crime and which would have a bigger impact. The reason the United States has a unique number of guns for an affluent country, off the charts. We also have a unique amount of gun violence for an affluent country, off the charts. When you break that down further and you look at little studies, what you see again and again and again is the thing that leads to more gun violence and more gun deaths are more guns. More guns in circulation, more really powerful guns. And so why do we, when you look at the charts, the other countries are all kind of down here for gun deaths, and we're up here. We're off the chart. The reason for that is because of the guns. That is why we have so much gun crime. To pretend otherwise is to ignore reality. Every country has mental health problems. Every single one.
But if that's the case, okay, if that's the case, David, then why we have far more guns now in the country than we had, say, 20 years ago. Gun sales have just exploded, particularly during the Obama administration. We have not seen a commensurate increase in gun violence. So, I mean, you look back to the 1980s, in cities like Los Angeles, late 80s, early 90s, I mean, every weekend, it was just horrific gun violence. We have far more guns in circulation now than we did then. So how do you contend that it's total volume of guns that is what makes the difference?
It's not a one-to-one relationship, right? Because you also see basically all kinds of crime are lower than they were in the 80s, including non-gun crimes. So there's this independent variable of what's going on with crime in society that then gets turbocharged by gun availability. But there is no society that has our number of guns that doesn't have a horrifically high gun death rate, right? And there is no society that has very few guns and has a gun death rate anywhere near ours. It's also, sometimes I think we put too much weight on studies. Logic matters too, right? Like it is only logical that more guns lead to more gun violence. And that becomes all the more the case when you see that states with more guns have more gun violence. It's not one-to-one, and your point is important. It's not like you put 50% more guns on the street and you get 50% more gun crime. But if what we said was, boy, all we care about in our society is reducing gun violence, if that is all we cared about, it would be very clear what we should do. We should massively reduce the number of guns that are in circulation and reduce access to them. Now, I preface this by saying this doesn't necessarily point to the solution, and I understand that we have a Second Amendment. I understand that many people believe deeply in the right to own a gun. I'm just saying we need to accept that the cost of our gun culture is a level of gun death that looks like nothing else around the world. And we are not going to solve that if we put money into mental health. You know, we might make tiny differences around the margins, but the way to reduce gun deaths is to reduce access to guns. And it doesn't seem like that's going to happen. I'm not predicting it's going to happen. I'm just saying that's reality. And I don't.
And how do you do that if you have the Supreme Court in the Heller decision, as you know, determined there's an individual right under the Second Amendment to own a gun for personal protection? So if that is the baseline, and you have the ability of people to have weapons, that doesn't control for the numbers of any individual can have, but we probably have a higher number of guns per person than we have had historically in recent decades with so many people having multiple weapons. How do you then restrict it given the Heller decision?
I think it's extremely difficult. And it's not just Heller. We're about to get another decision from the Supreme Court in
the New York case
that's probably going to restrict states' abilities to regulate guns carried outside the home. I think most likely cases that we're not going to restrict it. I mean, the fact that the murder of children at Newtown didn't lead to more gun legislation has left me assuming that we should assume that we're just not going to get serious gun legislation, that a large part of the country has decided that it is comfortable with the amount of gun violence that we have. That said, advocates who believe deeply in gun regulation, who want to try to save lives, they should keep on pushing, because maybe they'll finally come to some compromise. There clearly are some Republicans who are open to doing this. So Democrats and Republicans who both want to do it, they should keep trying. And maybe the politics will change in some way that I'm not expecting. I'm certainly not suggesting anybody who believes in this should give up. I just think, I don't think there's like a secret way to solve this. Guns lead to gun crime. We have more guns than any other country in the world. The politics of gun regulation are stuck. I'm not telling anyone what to do. I'm just saying, I don't see a way we get to meaningful gun regulation in this country in the immediate future.
Let me go to some questions from our viewers. I do want to come back to ask you about COVID, because you've gotten a lot of heat for things that you've written on COVID, and I do want to give you a chance to respond to some of that. But Herbert asks, how much was the response to the pandemic cause of inflation? In other words, overstimulation. This is a bit what we talked about earlier. If you had to assign a percentage, what would you give it?
Oh, I would trust a real economist. I'm a journalist, so I wouldn't trust my percentage. But what I would say is a meaningful minority. So if someone wanted to claim that our policy response was 70%, I would say I don't believe it. If someone wanted to say it was 1%, I'd say, I think I'll take the over on that. You know, if someone wanted to argue for 10 or 20 or 25 or 30, you know, I'd listen. I mean, look, I'd listen to any argument, but I assume it ends up somewhere in the meaningful minority of our inflation problem. And again, the thing I pointed out logic, the way to think about that logically is countries that did less stimulus also have really bad inflation right now. So that's the kind of thing to keep in your mind.
Also on this issue of inflation, Rachel in Seminole, Florida, asks, has the tight labor market and workers' ability to demand higher wages a contributing factor to inflation?
Yes, it absolutely is. And so there is some, you know, some silver lining in there, which is workers have gone a long time without healthy raises. And so, you know, the idea that workers are getting raises is good. The problem is workers also have to buy the items whose price is affected by the wages of other workers. And history sort of suggests that it's not really healthy, you know, to have 7% inflation and 8% wage growth. That tends to spiral, that people aren't sure just what inflation will be, that companies aren't sure, that really what you want is, you know, a few percentage points of inflation, and then you want wage growth that's a little higher than that. So, you know, 2% inflation and 4% wage growth, something like that. And that's not what we're looking at.
Stephen asks, would lifting Trump's tariffs help to mitigate inflation?
Yeah, probably a little bit, but probably not much. And look, there'd be a cost, right? Tariffs protect domestic industries. So the question is, the whole would probably gain at the expense of some domestic industries. I tend to think that the bigger power of tariffs is their power as a tool of foreign policy. And so I think probably the most important use of tariffs right now for the US isn't the small differences in economics that it may have, but what is it that allows the US to use its tariff regime to build an alliance of countries around the world that are worried about things like China and worried about things like Russia.
We have Judith in Seattle who asks, what are millennials looking at in terms of voting these days? What are their political views?
Young people are quite liberal, quite left. There really is no sign yet of a break back to the right among the younger generation. It's not like, oh, you know, people in their late 20s are really left wing, but people in their early 20s are more moderate or more right wing. We don't see that. And I think it's important to remember there's this cliche that everyone's liberal when they're young and then they get conservative when they're older. It's not wholly without merit, but it's mostly without merit. Generations tend to have particular political characteristics. And so people who came of age in the 1980s, people who are now in their 50s, for example, those people tend to be fairly conservative. They came of age when Ronald Reagan was president. Many of them think positively about that period and about him, and it kind of stamped them. Similarly, people who came of age during the New Deal tend to be Democrats for their whole lives. So I don't think that we should assume that today's liberal 20 and 30-year-olds are going to end up as conservative 50 and 60-year-olds. If anything, I would assume the opposite about most of them, that they will continue to have the politics that they have today.
Well, particularly if they have lower rates of home ownership and things like that, which tend to correspond to perhaps a moderating of political perspective. If fewer kids, less home ownership, those things that we've thought of as typically carry along with more moderate views.
Yeah,
So,
and not only that, but more legitimate concern about the world that we are leaving them because of climate change, right?
And a huge effect on younger Americans, no question. We have a question from Eric in Los Angeles. Can Congress or the Biden administration ameliorate the supply chain problems we face?
Not really. I mean, they can try in a whole bunch of ways. They can do things like, create incentives for ports to remain open all day. But supply chains are things that you can't really stand up overnight. There are also things that for the most part are predominantly operated by the private sector. It is very hard. I mean, I think that, and we can talk a little bit more about this if we talk about COVID if you want, but I think basically probably the best thing that the government can try to do for the supply chain is try to move us back to a more normal world where we have COVID under control. The government can't all that easily open new factories to do things. I mean, it does that in a war, but government's not going to open a new factory to have more minivans on the market.
Deborah asks, is it likely if Republicans lose ground in November, as unlikely as that might be, she says, do you think that they would adopt a strategy of claiming that elections were stolen?
Oh, I think it's sometimes useful to assume an outcome and then try to think about it, because it kind of clears away the brush of, well, how likely is it? And so that's a really interesting question. It's like, let's imagine a world like nearly everyone else who's looked at the polls. I assume the Republicans are going to take control of the House and probably the Senate too, and have a very good midterm. But let's imagine a world where that doesn't happen. I think certainly there will be a number of Republicans, sort of Trump-friendly Republicans, who claim that. It is extremely dangerous and damaging to have figures in a democracy who are not willing to accept defeat, who basically are not willing to say, we lost, and then try to figure out an agenda that's winning. It's extremely dangerous if you talk to scholars about it. So far, and I'm not blasé about the threat to democracy at all, but so far, Republicans who accept results have managed to basically matter more than those who reject it. We saw that in the Trump voting, in the Trump claims of vote fraud that were false. We saw it in how Mitch McConnell behaved. I think one of the most important things to watch is, do those Republicans who can accept defeat continue to win out? If they don't, I worry deeply about our democracy.
Nancy.
Where I thought you were going was, what would explain it if Republicans have a bad midterm? I don't know the answer, but it's an interesting thing to think about. Sorry.
Well, this dovetails with a question that was asked by our viewer, Jen, asking about the impact potentially of the overturning of Roe v. Wade.
Yes.
Is that something that could so galvanize Democratic voters that Democrats are surprisingly successful in November?
It could. I would just remind people that there is a very good chance that you're surrounded by people who have the same opinions on abortion as you do in our polarized, sordid country. And what that means is that Democrats often underestimate just how many Americans believe in very significant restrictions on abortion. Democrats particularly underestimate even how many Democrats believe in at least meaningful restrictions on abortions, including female Democrats. The gender gap on abortion is smaller than it is on many other issues. And so it's true that polling has moved a little bit toward the pro-choice position and away from the pro-life position over the last couple of years, as it has seemed likely or possible that Roe might fall. So this could be changing. But Democrats have spent a long time telling themselves that what America really cares about is protecting abortion rights. And so far, that political bet has been a bad one. Americans have been quite willing to vote for people who favor very tough abortion restrictions. And so I go into this assuming that abortion is not going to be the magic political issue that Democrats think it is. But having said that, if you told me today, to take the last question, that Republicans had a really disappointing midterm, I would probably say to you, well, my guess is that one of the most likely explanations for that is that, in fact, there is this majority that really doesn't want us to go too far either way on abortion, and Republicans went too far. It's plausible. I just think Democrats are surrounded by so many fellow pro-choice people that they exaggerate actually how many people in the country feel that way.
Well, we'll have to see. I would not be surprised with the Supreme Court decision that it really does galvanize Democratic voters, but we'll see what happens, because the point you make is certainly historically accurate. I did want to ask you about COVID before we close. I got a lengthy email from Dr. Ken Zangwill, Harvard UCLA Medical Center, where he's director of infection prevention and control, knew that I was going to be moderating our discussion. And he had a number of concerns about the reporting you've done on COVID. I'm sure you've heard these on numerous occasions. They include what you've had to say about masking and the effectiveness of masking, and that he thinks that the studies show masking is far more effective than how you portrayed it in your writing. Also, that there's a rather strong demarcation between 65 and older Americans' vulnerability to COVID versus younger people. He thinks it's much more nuanced, and that with diabetes and other pre-existing conditions, there is much more of a threat to people under 65 than perhaps you were seeding in your writing. So as you look at it now, my question for you is, have you rethought of any of the positions along the way that you've taken on COVID, or do you think the data still largely supports the writing that you've done?
So I try to rethink the positions I'm taking. I mean, every day might be an exaggeration, but certainly every week. You know, as I said, one of the things that I do at the end of every year is I look back and I say, these are the things I think I got wrong in the previous year. I didn't come up with that idea, other journalists did. I would encourage all journalists and also public experts who have a public profile to do that as well. Sort of look back and say, what are the things I got right and I got wrong? And so in my 2021 version of that column, I mentioned three things. I mentioned inflation, I underestimated it. I mentioned Delta. I underestimated how much it would lead to infections among the vaccinated, not serious illness, but infections among the vaccinated. So that's sort of consistent, I think, with what the critique would be. And then I also mentioned boosters, which actually kind of doesn't cut either way on these COVID debates. I was initially a little bit more skeptical of how important boosters were, and then the Israeli data sort of persuaded me. There was a debate among experts, and I sort of presented it as a debate. In the end, I think one side won that. So look, I think everyone gets things wrong. I think the general thrust of my writing, I feel very comfortable with, which is I think COVID has been a horrible, horrible virus and pandemic, the worst in a century. As a society, I think we've made two different mistakes. The most damaging has been we've had a lot of people who refused to take the vaccine. They predominantly come from the political right. Weirdly, COVID has become yet another issue that has become very polarized. That's been the biggest problem, the right's downplaying of COVID risks and skepticism of the vaccine. But we've had a mirror problem on the left. Again, I'll emphasize, not as big, but still a problem, in which I think a lot of people on the left have exaggerated the risks of COVID, particularly to the vaccinated. And they have downplayed the incredible costs of allowing COVID to dominate society for months and months on end. So liberal places were more likely to close schools. In retrospect, that was a huge mistake. We have been ignoring the fact that many, many measures of societal well-being have deteriorated during the pandemic. Mental health, traffic fatalities have gone way up. Gun violence has gone way up. All kinds of measures of people happiness and well-being has deteriorated. Right. And I think the left has made this mistake of let's always wear masks, even if, by the way, Places that voted for Joe Biden, which have worn more masks, haven't had less COVID infection than places that voted for Trump, according to all the available data. Let's just wear masks anyway. Let's close
David.
schools if we get a few cases. And I think we really have to think about this more of a balance, which is COVID has terrible costs and shutting down society for COVID has terrible costs. And I think many people on the left, and when you look at the polling, particularly people who identify as very liberal, have not sufficiently consider that balance. And I've basically asked people to consider both
David.
halves of the ledger.
David, we are out of time, but just quick, like 30 seconds, really, really close sort of wrap up. We've talked about so many topics tonight as we are in this political season, the state of our nation today in 30 seconds.
But actually, let me pivot from the COVID thing just to say, which is, one of the reasons why the pandemic has been so hard is all of the isolation and all of the loneliness and all of the disruption. And in a time when I know many Americans are very worried about the state of our society, for good reason, our democracy, our climate, all kinds of things, I would just ask people to remember that there is an upside to the downside of the pandemic, which is that human beings and Americans generally like each other. You mentioned before that when you look at the polling on race, people say they like the people in their community, even if they're different from them. And many of the struggles that we've had with the pandemic come from the fact that we are social creatures. Students like being at school together. Kids like being on the rug together, doing stuff together. We like having dinner together. You and I would be having a more enjoyable conversation if we were sitting on a stage rather than looking into a computer. And I look forward to doing that with you in person sometime. And so I would just ask people to think about when sometimes you're feeling particularly down about the state of the country or the state of society today, just remember, this hasn't been a normal period. And as we are able to continually to get back to more and more of actual human interaction and interacting with our fellow human beings and realizing that they're not Twitter avatars and they're not just boxes on a Zoom, they're real life, three-dimensional, living, breathing human beings. I think that there are going to be a lot of joys that we have lost that we're going to rediscover.
I have to say, just from the public events I've been a part of, outdoors, that people are so excited to be together in person, to be outside and seeing their friends, people they haven't seen in a long time. So that's a wonderful note to end on. David, thank you. This has been a great conversation. And thank you for being so open to taking such a wide range of topics in this format. Appreciate it very, very much.
Thanks for your great questions. It was really enjoyable, Larry.
Thank you. And I also want to remind you that coming up next week, next Wednesday at 5 o'clock Pacific, 8 o'clock Eastern, CNN and The Atlantic celebrated polling expert Ron Brownstein. Ron will be talking about the 2022 midterms, doomsday for Democrats. That's what the question asks. Bob Shrum, the director of the Center for the Political Future at the University of Southern California, will be in conversation with Ron Brownstein. Next Wednesday, June 15th, 5 Pacific, 8 o'clock Eastern Time, wherever you're viewing our America to Crossroads programs. We appreciate you joining us each week. And I remind you to please financially support the program put on by these two nonprofits, Jews United for Democracy and Justice or Community Advocates, Inc. You can visit the website of either one of these nonprofits to make your contribution to support these important programs. Thank you for joining us. Have a great night.